Well, thank you very much, Perrin. Thank you as well, Catherine. It's nice to see you as well. And Perrin, when I was a cadet at RMC, you guys were setting us up to have the EH-101 helicopter. Do you remember that? And by the time I got out to the RCAF, my legal colleague, eventually Jean Chrétien, canceled the EH-101. So I was still a navigator, an aviator on the old Sea King helicopter. So certainly I appreciate your commitment to public service and to our men and women in uniform. And I'd like to thank the entire Chamber staff for organizing such a great and important debate and discussion. I also want to thank the Chamber for not just having this 360 exercise to focus on our economic future and prosperity, your Leadership Council for a post-COVID economic recovery is appreciated and an important sign that the private sector, big and small, has an important role to play. And the Canada 360 allows us to take stock of where we are as a country, and more importantly, what path we need to take. Now, I remember 360 reviews and continuous improvement from my time in the private sector, both the large law firm environment and at Procter & Gamble. Organizations must look on a 360 basis for what's happening now and where we need to go. So you're showing great leadership. And in my view, in the absence of such leadership from the federal government, in fact, 2 years with no budget, the longest time in Canada's history, conflicting statements about the economy amid a global health crisis, and an ideological approach to economic development that has led to the flight of $160 billion of investment from Canada before COVID-19. It's also divided parts of the country. We have tried to work with the government despite our frustrations amid this crisis. You know, as a leader, it reminded me of a great private sector quote from the late Lee Iacocca. In times of great stress or adversity, it's always best to keep busy and to plow your anger and your energy into something positive. The Conservatives are plowing our energy into a plan to secure our economic future. And we look forward to partnering with you and your Leadership Council. Aujourd'hui, vous avez montré l'importance de travailler ensemble pour surmonter une crise sanitaire et économique. Vous avez montré que le futur du Canada n'appartient pas juste au gouvernement. Le futur de notre pays va être bâti par des partenariats entre les citoyens, le secteur privé et nos gouvernements. Mais surtout, il va être bâti par des Canadiens comme vous, qui veulent survivre notre pays. Today, I'd like to share my vision of what lies ahead as we rebuild from this health and economic crisis. The challenges and the opportunities in a 360 sense. Yesterday, the IMF said Canada must justify its post-pandemic spending before committing to significant new spending in the budget that's been promised for months. The IMF also said Canada should commit to a clear fiscal anchor. Without one, the IMF warned that the credibility of our fiscal framework will be weakened. This is a stern warning and one that Canada must heed. But I'm worried about our economic recovery now more than ever. For weeks, we have watched the Liberal government let us down on vaccines. I really wish they hadn't. I've said every day, probably the first opposition leader every day, saying he wants the government to succeed. I do, because Canadians need them to succeed on vaccines. But they have let us down. And I'm very worried the same slow and confused approach will happen with respect to our economic recovery. As you know, Canada is at a crossroads, and the two paths before us could not be more different. The Trudeau government path veers off into the unknown with risky shutdowns and stark changes that will leave millions behind. This is what Mr. Trudeau calls his reimagined economy post-COVID, one where his team and Ottawa picks and chooses which jobs Canadians should have, in what parts of the country, and in what sector. It's a path where the connected few will get richer, while many, many working families will get left behind. It's a path the IMF suggests will damage the credibility of our fiscal framework. Then there's the other path, the one that is steady and balanced, our path. It may not be as glamorous or as hashtag friendly, but it will get all of us safely to a stronger, more secure destination. It will deliver us to a Canada where those who have struggled the most through this pandemic are able to get back to work. A Canada where manufacturing at home is bolstered, where wages go up, and where families can continue to dream of providing a better life for their children and grandchildren. This pandemic has taken a real toll on our country. Hundreds of thousands of Canadians have lost their jobs. Many are losing hope. Many entrepreneurs are worried their small business won't survive to the summer. And vaccine delivery delays are further impacting business confidence across the country. We've gone weeks without a reliable supply of vaccines. It is never encouraging to see Canada in 40th place on any measure. Even when Mr. Trudeau finally cleans up the backlog and the mess, it will be on the backs of healthcare workers across the country that the pieces are left to be picked up. And who will be picking up the pieces of our economy? Let's not mince words. Our future prosperity is at stake. And that is what the next election, whenever it comes, will be about. Who can secure a strong economic future for Canada following COVID-19? It's time to put an end to an Ottawa knows best approach. I believe we need to champion Canadian workers, their families, small businesses, and their communities to secure our economic recovery. And this is personal to me. As you said, Perrin, I'm from a community that has a long history of manufacturing. Growing up in Bowmanville, my dad worked at General Motors at the plant in Oshawa. Our neighbors and friends were auto workers. As a kid, I attended forklift races hosted by the CAW. And 30 years later, as a brand new MP, Unifor was one of my first meetings. I know firsthand that organized labor builds strong communities and champions Canadian workers. We're going to need a Team Canada approach and with business, with organized labor to rebuild this economy after COVID-19. But as I've said for many months, private sector union membership has collapsed. In the 1950s, 1 in 3 private sector workers were union members. Today, it's closer to 1 in 25. Over the last couple of decades, I've seen the impact of this as parts of my region have been hollowed out and people left behind. Jobs left and some never came back. We also didn't move quickly enough on skilled training for some of those without jobs. In communities like mine, union jobs were an essential part of the balance between what was good for business and what was good for employees and their community. It was also great for all families in the neighborhood and the community because it kept our community strong. That balance is needed today more than ever before. I spoke with the Canadian Building Trades Unions yesterday about this very subject. And that's why Conservatives have been fighting alongside small businesses and organized labor to save Line 5 and the 30,000 jobs it supports across Southern Ontario. And we've been standing up alongside labor leaders to ensure that Buy America doesn't turn into Don't Buy Canadian. It's why the Conservatives were stronger voices in recent years for steel and aluminum workers impacted by US tariff and trade action. And I'm proud that our Conservative team worked with unions to apply pressure on other political parties. And just yesterday, that pressure resulted in Parliament creating a committee to examine Canada-US economic issues, including Line 5, including Buy America. The economic relationship between Canada and the US will be one of the most important pillars of our economic recovery from COVID-19. Trade between Canada and the US exceeds $1.5 billion per day. Supply chains are integrated and have been since the Auto Pact of the 1960s. And Buy America procurement rules and the absence of government advocacy for North American energy security puts all of that and our strong trade history in jeopardy. Prime Minister Trudeau has had projects canceled by the US multiple times over 3 administrations. After 5 years, we have no softwood lumber agreement. And the Liberals have let down unionized workers in the steel, aluminum, and auto sectors time after time. At a time when both Canada and the US need to be focused on getting people back to work and restoring our economic way of life post-COVID-19, this Canada-US committee will get answers for Canadian families worried about that US market access, worried about their jobs and their future. Those are the people I'm accountable to. Everyday Canadian workers, small business owners, entrepreneurs, and their families. The Trudeau government seems only to be accountable to friends and insiders. It's time to start putting everyday Canadian workers first. Canada must be clear-eyed trade realists. I've said many times that 30 years ago, the Western world made a bet. We would allow China to have preferential access to our markets while they protected their own. Western countries looked the other way on human rights, intellectual property theft, and diplomatic aggression in order to enhance trade with the booming Chinese economy, hoping that over time, the communist regime would begin to liberalize, respect human rights, and play by the rules. We were wrong. And now we must chart a new course. And that was true even before we learned of China's genocide against the Uyghur Muslims. We now understand that while it may be more efficient and affordable to make drugs, masks, and ventilators in China, it's not in our national interest to make things vital to our security and increasingly to our prosperity in China. When the most efficient outcome does not align with our national interest, a conservative government will ensure that our national interest comes first. It is in our national interest to become more self-reliant in core areas. It is in our national interest to diversify and help develop new markets and support the reshoring of strategic manufacturing capacity to Canada. Great opportunities actually await in the realignment of global trade if Canada helps leads it. We must be forward-looking and establish new supply chains with democratic countries like India. Canada must also open its eyes to opportunities in developed economies and close allies. For years, I've been advocating for a CANZUK agreement. This trade and mobility deal would provide a stepping stone for further partnerships with the United Kingdom, Australia, and New Zealand. Imagine the possibilities of exporting products to these countries tariff-free and linking up to their supply chains. This isn't just a matter of economics. CANZUK is our best political option to build a bloc of aligned democratic countries to diversify our trade routes and at the same time solidify our alliances. Canada needs to realize the next 2 decades will be defined globally by a clash between the United States and China. We need to position ourselves accordingly, and therefore we must become trade realists. But that will require strong leadership at home, and it will require renewed solidarity at home to overcome the deep divisions between the winners and losers in our society and in our economy. The divisions that are only worse now after COVID, between those who have had the opportunity to pursue higher learning and those who have not, between Bay Street and Main Street, between those with a salary, benefits, and a pension, and those without, between those with connections to liberal insiders and regular folks who have to play by the rules. between the jobs the Trudeau government values and those they don't. Free markets alone won't solve our problems. GDP growth alone won't either. The goal of economic policy is more than just wealth creation. We need policies to shore up the core units of society: family, neighborhood, service, and country. Canada is a community, not a corporation with 37 million shareholders. We need policies that unite us, that build solidarity and wealth and opportunity. We must also be confident enough to know that Ottawa does not have all the policy answers and will often have to follow local efforts as a partner. There's leadership in knowing when to be a partner. The well-being of Canadian families is at the core of strong communities that in turn build a united and more inclusive country. As the father of two, my greatest worry is failing to leave a better Canada to my kids. That's what motivates me. I love this country and I know our greatest days lay ahead. That's why every day I'm telling Canadians about the vision our Conservatives have for a stronger, more prosperous, and more united Canada. As we recover from COVID-19, it's time for certainty. It's time for ethical and competent leadership. It's time to put jobs and opportunity front and center. And I want you to know that a Conservative government will have your back. We are at a crossroads. I know what path we must take to rebuild this great country and get Canadians back to work. It is one we can take together, where no one will be left behind. It's up to us, the leaders on this call, and your thousands of employees to rededicate ourselves to Canada. I hope you will join me to rebuild our country and secure our future. Thank you.
Mr. O'Toole, thank you very much for that presentation. And I'm looking forward to having the chance to have a bit of a fireside chat with you in terms of your vision for the country and where we could be going from here. You mentioned in your remarks the fact that we will likely be looking at a federal budget very soon. The last one was before the last election. We've gone the longest at this point, probably in history, between full federal budgets. What specifically, you mentioned the importance of having a fiscal anchor, but what other elements will you be looking for in a budget which will be critical to repairing Canada's economic health?
Well, thanks, Perrin. A couple of things. First is jobs. I think when we talk about GDP growth, when we talk about the economy, what comes down to the family, dining room table? It's the well-being of the community. Do mom or dad have a job if they're working or were working before COVID? So the employment metrics will be very, very important. As we ramp down some of the large emergency spending, both on wage support and direct CERB type benefits, we need jobs and opportunity for people to return to. So what I've said is our major focus will be jobs in every sector and in every part of the country. And this is why we can't pick or choose the reimagined path designed in a tower in Ottawa or Gatineau. It needs to partner with small business, with industries that right now are starting to boom again, including the resource sector, and then foster innovation and investment from the sidelines, the private sector money that's sitting, waiting to see if we become competitive and a predictable and safe place to invest again. So jobs will be a key metric, as well as infrastructure funding. Once again, anytime that infrastructure funding can be quickly deployed and be a multiplier to better market access, to enhance rail or transportation links, to improve our productivity, like Australia did a few years ago, we have to not only get it out the door quickly, make sure it has that multiplier. And here again, we will hear from businesses where some of the catch points are that we need to address with some of these dollars, partnering with municipalities, provinces, but also the private sector. So as we get our fiscal house in order over the next decade, jobs for Canadians, quick support for infrastructure will be two key measures that we'll be pushing, Perrin.
Cool. Okay, so if the goal is jobs and one of the tools is infrastructure, what other elements should be there? How do we unlock private sector investment? How do we restore growth to the economy, which will allow us to manage the debt that we've accumulated?
Well, there's a few things there that we're working on that we hope to roll out in the coming weeks and months, some of which will be very exciting. Certainly, we have to look at the small business crisis. There are, depending on whose statistics you quote, you guys have some CFIB and others, small and medium-sized businesses, there's as many as a third that are worried about their solvency over the next year. And while the government has announced with great fanfare, highly affected sector packages, large employer packages, many of them are too burdensome to access and actually haven't been rolled out. Months ago, probably 8 months ago, the government said they were going to take a sector by sector approach. There has been no such approach, and there has been no partnering with private sectors and with organizations like yours. That's why it's so important to see the leadership you demonstrated with your council. So that small business piece will be one. We also think, Perrin, that there can be some innovative tax policy to actually encourage investment from the private sector, from Canadians in innovation in Canada. I've talked about sometimes the use of flow-through shares and other vehicles that can actually encourage a multiplier from private sector funds. We need the economic recovery to be a strong private sector-led recovery. And this is where I worry about the reimagined scenario of Mr. Trudeau, the one path I talked about. If we're not partnering with the people that are actually taking risks, that are actually signing paychecks, that are desperate to maybe bring back some of the people that they've laid off, the government will be totally disconnected from the private sector that really needs to recover. So that will be another key metric, simplifying the tax code and encouraging capital investment.
I want to pick up on one of the questions that's been submitted from the audience. Obviously, we're looking at a level of federal debt of $1.2, $1.3 trillion, and the federal deficit is at record levels. What is your plan to bring the federal deficit back under control? Do you have a strategy to do that? And over what period of time would you achieve it?
Yeah, we have a plan, and we will have a detailed plan prior to the election, Perrin, but I've used the timeline of a decade to get back to fiscal balance, because in the short term, there will be some assistance needed for those highly affected sectors, for that saving small business, and for some infrastructure stimulus. But if we don't have a plan and we don't focus on employment, as I said, in every sector in every region of the country, it will be hard to wind people off of programs. That's why, of course, the day the wage subsidy was announced, I reached out to several Liberal cabinet members that I knew. I had offered to serve in a joint cabinet when I suspended my leadership race to put the country first. A 10% wage subsidy and the confusion over that for several weeks led to higher than needed unemployment. And even today, Mr. Trudeau was chiding us in the House, suggesting we were standing up for business. We wanted to preserve jobs, not put everyone on a permanent CERB benefit. That seems to be the Liberal approach. Even today, he was suggesting that they will just have unrestrained spending as far as the eye can see, when the parliamentary budget officer said we have the fiscal capacity to maybe do this for another year, 2 years. We have to get our fiscal house in order in a way that's equitable, that doesn't leave people behind. And that's why we need to leverage private sector opportunities. So I'm using that decade timeframe now. We will see what the situation of the books are like when the budget comes out. But it was the Conservatives that got Canada out of the last global recession faster than any other country in the G7. We will do that again post-COVID.
We have a number of questions that have come in from the audience, but I recognize that we're fast running out of time. Can I perhaps ask a couple of them? One is specifically with regard to Canada-US relations. You mentioned your disappointment with the government's handling of the bilateral relationship. What specifically would you have done?
Well, listen, I warned the government that the steel and aluminum tariffs were real. And in fact, sadly, the media ignored it all as well. We needed in Washington to talk about trade and security. As you would know, Perrin, from your time as a Minister of the Crown, in Washington, you do not talk trade without security. Mr. Trudeau has been offside with 3 administrations with respect to China and with Huawei. And my suggestion very early on was to leverage the NORAD relationship and ballistic missile defense and recommitting to an integrated Canada-US economic, defense, homeland security, and critical commodity strategy. We should be aligned on steel when it comes to transshipment by Chinese producers. The Trudeau government misplayed the NAFTA negotiations. They were cut a lot of slack by people because obviously they knew that the people knew they were dealing with a difficult administration. But when you know that ahead of time, be smarter. They were not. And Mr. Trudeau toured steel plants in Sault Ste. Marie and Hamilton, said, we avoided tariffs, we had your back. And 2 weeks later, there were tariffs. They misjudged the situation terribly, Perrin. And this is where the aluminum supply in the Saguenay, the base there, Bagotville, was partially built by the United States to safeguard that supply during World War II. Our Kitimat refinery in British Columbia, we produce some of the greenest aluminum in the world, and we got worse preferential access to Mexico than China did. So we will make sure that that Canada-US preferred relationship is again enhanced, and there's collaboration on both on security, trade, and alignment with respect to markets like China.
Final question. You've had in many ways, a preferred position to watch the events of the last year, where the government has been forced, as all of us have, to deal with a crisis that none of us anticipated, none of us have ever lived through before. Taking off your partisan hat for a minute, just as a student of government, can you talk to us about the lessons learned? There will be future crises. They may not be the same as this one. What are some of the lessons that you see from your vantage point in Parliament that any future government should be looking at as it prepares for potential crises in the future?
Well, my partisan hat is pretty sewed on tight, Perrin, but I'll do my best to pull it off for a moment. My biggest frustration actually has been there's been zero lessons learned approach by this government. When I first got briefed by Minister Haiju, I asked to review the lessons learned approach from the first wave of the pandemic. 2 days after my meeting with her, she announced a lesson learned exercise. Did we think that the procurement of vaccines would be any different than the run on PPE we saw in March and April? And I'll tell you, I was working with the Ford government and ministers of the federal crown to secure mask and other critical production to Canada. We need that self-sufficiency. You've heard me talk about it. We've maintained it, as you would know, Perrin, in defense and security areas because they have been exempt from WTO trade rules. Are masks or PPE any less critical? We've learned now that we need capacity for this. The real miss that I think is explaining why we're in 40th place in vaccine rollout was the failure to work collaboratively with the pharmaceutical sector. The Liberal government, right up until Christmas, was still fighting with them on changes to the Patented Medicine Pricing Review Board. There was a terrible relationship between the Trudeau government and that sector. And then when they decided to partner with China, there wasn't going to be a single Western producer touch that relationship. So that is where we lost 3 to 4 months. And that is why we're going to be getting vaccines more in April than in January. And that will delay our economic recovery. So here's the difference, Perrin. I talked about the US relationship. I served alongside the US on some of my operations in the Canadian Armed Forces, worked for Procter & Gamble, one of the oldest US corporations. We need a prime minister who has attention to detail, who understands the private sector and is proud of what we do here in Canada, whether it's the resources in the ground or the resources in the heads of our smart young people at universities. We need everybody working. It's got to be all hands on deck.
Mr. O'Toole, thank you very much. It's been a very interesting half hour. This is a critical time for all of us. You have an exceptionally tough job in terms of your role in Parliament, and we are very grateful to you for sharing with us your vision for the country and what you would be doing if called upon to lead the country. Thank you for being with us, and good luck to you with your work in Parliament.
I'm grateful for you, Perrin, and your leaders. I saw Linda on as I started. Linamar, CAA, a whole range of companies stepped up in a major way. We need to leverage that leadership to secure the future together. It's not just Ottawa, it's Canadians together. So thank you for your continued leadership as well, and stay healthy.